I'm Gene, and this is Perfect Flow. I'm a New Zealand-based athlete and coach focused on optimizing performance, health, and well-being. While I have a professional background in biomedical engineering, I've chosen to follow my more immediate passions for running, endurance, adventure, movement, nutrition, lifestyle, community, psychology, and personal growth. My goal in starting this podcast is to connect with bright minds to extract the information I need to live a life that makes sense and feels good, and share those conversations with others. Apart from your favorite podcast app, the best places to follow my work are perfectflow.nz, genebeveridge.nz, and Perfect Flow on Facebook. Hi guys, hope you're well. Gene here, back with another podcast of a slightly different sort. Today's podcast feels more like a little lesson. It's a little mini lecture on fueling and nutrition for endurance sport. While I was in Whangarei a couple of weeks ago, I sat down with my nutritionist to obviously talk about some of my own stuff, but also just to record something that I was hoping would add some value to others in the community. I know there's a lot of people dipping their toes into ultra running, and I think just a little foundational advice. Try not to complicate things, just keep it simple, and if people really want to take the sport further, I'm sure they'll reach out to professionals and experienced individuals for help. But I think this episode is a great starting point for anyone who wants to know the basics of fueling and how we can take in the right kinds of energy to get us to the finish line and what things to look for. Of course, if you want to take the sport more seriously, you really need to find out exactly how your body works best and find out the tools that you want to use most. And it's not going to be the same for everyone, but I think this is a great starting point for anyone who's new or for people who just want to remind themselves of some of the basic biology of nutrition and fueling. So I hope this is useful. If you do find it useful, please give some comments. Just reach out and say that you want more of this kind of stuff, or yep, that was good. Time for a second such episode to go in a little more detail on some of the things that we just skimmed over. Really just trying different things, of course, with this podcast so far. So really open and very keen to hear the feedback. So I hope you enjoy my talk with nutritionist Tom Shand. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Nice to be here, Gene.
Yeah, this should be interesting. I'm in a fairly educational mood, so keen to hear about nutrition, just the basics of nutrition, and try to give some of my listeners, give them some confidence, or maybe bring some of the new ones up to speed with nutrition, basic nutrition for sports, and what to look for. Just a little bit from my experience to set the scene. It was me working with you 2 years ago that I'd been eating a balanced diet, like a fairly normal diet, and was just on like the real high octane buzz of training, and was just eating all the time. And of course that's great for many things, but it was you that suggested to me, how about doing a training without food just one time? Yeah. And of course you've set me on this trajectory now of really seeing the endurance benefits of doing fasted training, and I've taken the fasting a lot further and found many more benefits that at least to me have been significant and very interesting, at least. So ups to you for suggesting those things and introducing me to them. But yeah, if we can wind things back to the basics and maybe just give a little background of what you currently work as and where you study, maybe.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So that was 2 years ago, was it? Seems like a long time ago. Currently I'm a lecturer or a tutor at North Tech here in Whangarei in the Sport and Rec program in sports nutrition. My background is also in diabetes. I'm a diabetes dietitian here in Northland. But my main interest is definitely sports nutrition and endurance nutrition. So I did the IOC diploma or postgraduate diploma in sports nutrition, which really kind of opened my eyes to all the different possibilities in sports nutrition. And yeah, so when I talked to you, it was if we can relate that maybe for your listeners as to why that advice was, I guess what that's looking at is the different energy systems that humans use, and trying to train all of those energy systems, not just one of them. And when I met you, you were very much in a bit of a transition zone or transition stage between your orienteering and entering the Kepler.
Yeah, and that was my first race over 3 hours.
Yeah. So I kind of and from what you told me, we could assume that you were your petrol tank, your fast burning was going at full tilt. But I thought we'd see what we could do with your diesel tank and all that slower behind the scenes chugging away, I guess, and seeing if we could increase that for you. And it was a bit of an experiment, I think, but it sounds like it worked for you.
Yeah, it definitely fell short early in the training. I guess I found how reliant I was on carbohydrates, and it just took me, I think one of the early sessions you had me do was just a late session one day, and then just an hour on the bike before breakfast the next day, and I hit the wall.
Right, yeah.
I just hit the wall, an hour easy on the bike on the wind trainer, and it was like, I knew this was going to happen, obviously, and I think a few weeks ago I did 3.5 hours fasted on hills.
Wow.
Just stable energy the whole way. So I've come a long way in 2 years. Yeah.
But 2 years is a long time as well.
Yep.
To get that far. It's not something which happens overnight, is it?
Yeah.
And you've taken the approach where you don't do all your trainings fasted or anything like that?
No, just the long run, really.
Some of the
long run and maybe some morning jogs if I feel like it.
So you have it quite a...
Normally. I know over summer I did some more intense fasting stuff, but I haven't settled on a year-long routine.
Yeah, so I guess to explain all that, it's really looking at, we talked about carbohydrates there and them being your petrol, but also the idea that we have actually quite a small tank for our carbohydrates, and it's easily depleted. So if you're average, well-trained person, maybe they were doing a marathon, they went out and did a run without consuming food at a certain intensity, then it's deemed that they might hit the wall or bonk, or whatever you want to call it, after about 90 minutes or maybe 120 minutes, which isn't really good enough because a marathon takes longer than that for 99% of the population. So we look at how to use your fat stores, and which are essentially unlimited, and how your body can tap into them for energy. And so that's what we got you doing was training in a low carbohydrate environment where your body didn't have the carbohydrates to call on, so it was forced to learn to metabolize the fat. And as you saw, you weren't able to do that. But then with some specific strategies, your body learned to metabolize that fat. But that's actually, I guess, quite a advanced training technique, and it's certainly not something which you just jump into early on in your training.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. So in the body, I like to compare those two systems. What is the kind of equivalent? We've got fat on one side. Can you talk us through kind of how that fat gets used just quickly, and also on the carbohydrate side, how the kind of molecules involved? I know people are going to hear different terms like ketones, for example, and it's up to their imagination essentially what that means. And if you can provide that in a concise way.
Okay.
There's a lot of confusion.
I'll do my best. Yeah, sure. Okay, so maybe if you can, if you split it up into, the overarching ones are fat and carbohydrate that we've talked about. We'll start with carbohydrate because that's generally regarded as the body's preferred fuel, and why it's our body's preferred fuel. People might have debate about it. It's whether maybe some people would believe that it's because it's the most efficient fuel available to us, whereas other people might say it's because that's what the Western society, in New Zealand, we grow up eating that food.
So by efficient, do you mean it's got more energy concentrated, or there's less oxygen required for the same amount of energy?
Yeah, good question. So for carbohydrate, it's considered more efficient because it requires less oxygen to burn that 1 gram of carbohydrate to produce the energy. Whereas fat flips that on its head. It takes a bit more oxygen to burn fat, but the amount of energy you get from that fat when you do burn it is much higher than carbohydrates
per gram.
Per gram,
yeah.
And that oxygen thing there is worth talking about, because that's often the rate limiting step in performance, is delivering oxygen from outside of our body, the air that we breathe, to the muscles which are using it. So that's got to go into our lungs, from our lungs to our blood, through our heart, and pumped into the capillaries and the far reaches of our muscles. But then it's got to get from our capillaries to our cells, and then into the actual part of the cell where it then gets burned. And then that process of getting burned is a very simplified way of thinking about an incredibly complex cascade of enzymatic reactions with all these different bits and pieces. And training is all about every step that I just described. Your training program that you provide your clients is designed to improve and make more efficient. And so that's a long. I haven't really done it concisely, but
and the other word that might come up is glycogen.
So,
what's glycogen?
So glycogen is the stored form of carbohydrate. So if you eat a lolly or some sugar, a teaspoon of sugar, then that sugar will pretty quickly wind up in your blood as glucose, we call it, your blood glucose levels, and that can get delivered to the muscles. If you're out going for a walk or a run, then it will probably get burnt by your muscles. If you ate that sugar before you went to bed and you lay perfectly still and didn't move at all, then that sugar would get stored as glycogen. And that glycogen can get stored in your liver or in your muscles. And this is going back to your original question, that we can start to talk about intramuscular glycogen. And so when you're those fuels that you were talking about, the glycogen in your muscles is a very readily available source of fuel for yourself, and well-trained athletes will have very high levels of intramuscular glycogen. And it's actually the same with fat. You can store fat in your muscles as well. So people who have adapted to fat will have higher levels of fat within their muscles, and so that's why they're able to better use fat as a fuel. If you compared yourself now compared to 2 years ago, before you came on this journey, you would have high levels of intramuscular triglycerides, which are more closely matched to maybe the glycogen levels in your muscle, which is why you're able to call on both of those fuel sources. Where in the past you were better at using one.
Right, and without it having intramuscular triglycerides, it's got to come from the adipose tissue. So there's more transportation involved.
Yeah, and it's just less readily available. The transport systems aren't set up. There's less off ramps from the motorway into your muscles and things like that. So,
Right, so that sets the scene. But you're a nutritionist. So how do we influence these systems?
So I actually think that it starts with you, Gene, with your training program. So you will be setting your clients. And not just your client, anybody who's following a training program you're very unlikely to do the same session every day, or even if you're not training every day, if you're training 4 times a week, you're not going to do the same session 4 times a week. And if you are, then you're not training as well as you could be. So those different training sessions which you do are designed to stress different energy systems. So your long, slow training sessions are designed to stress your aerobic system, or the ones which burn oxygen. So those are certainly involve carbohydrates, but also do involve fat. Versus shorter, faster sessions might incorporate some anaerobic, which is exercise which doesn't use oxygen, which is very much reliant on carbohydrates. And then maybe if you do a gym session, it's looking at that power-based, what's the PCR, phosphocreatine system. So there are different energy systems involved, which a good training program will stress in different ways. And then the aim of the nutrition plan to go with that is twofold. And traditionally, nutrition plans have focused on providing optimum amounts of nutrients to adequately or optimally fuel that training session that somebody's undertaking. So if you're doing a long run, then we're talking pre-exercise nutrition, when you're loading up or not loading up, but you're having a carbohydrate-rich meal prior to that, to ensure that your liver and muscle glycogen stores are topped up so that there's lots of fuel available. And then during that long session, you consume carbohydrates to ensure that you continue to top up your fuel stores so that the fuel stores remain topped up and high. And then there's the post-training nutrition, which is recovery nutrition, where you're, again, more carbohydrates because you're replacing those carbohydrates that you burnt, so that for the rest of that day you feel energy, but from a performance point of view, so that tomorrow's training session is done optimally, in that you have enough fuel for that session. More recently, there's been a kind of a second branch on that, and we've discovered that that those training sessions you get better results from those training sessions, not only when you fuel them optimally, but also when you maximize the stress experience during those training sessions. So for your long run, if you don't give yourself carbohydrates, you're doing quite the opposite of fueling that session optimally. You're really starving that session, and it's forcing your bodies to become more efficient at using the fuel that is there. So you kind of have those two very distinct approaches where you can optimally fuel a session so that when you're doing that session it's sort of maximum quality, or you can starve that session so the quality of that session is going to be much lower, but you're going to get very different training adaptations from that. And as a result, you're a more metabolically complete athlete, I guess, because you've got more tools in your cellular tool belt in terms of burning through the fuel that you've got available.
Yeah, and some people do take that to the extreme, but could you just clarify where the extremes lie and where what you exactly had in mind, where that lies on the continuum?
Yeah, so I guess the ketones thing is the one extreme where you're chronically, or over a long period of time, you're not giving yourself carbohydrates, which forces your body into another energy system called ketosis, where your body uses ketones for fuel. And I would say that would be described as a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet when you're in ketosis. But a step back from that is quite common, and it's probably where it all started, is the low carbohydrate, high fat. And people do that as a sort of a lifestyle choice, as much as a performance choice, where they will, over a long, weeks, months, years, consume very low intake of carbohydrates and a very high fat intake. So 24 hours a day, they're metabolizing fat rather than carbohydrates, which was controversial to start with. I think it's been accepted as a fairly good way of dealing with a number of issues. But from a performance point of view, you are very, very efficient at burning fat as a fuel, and so you're able to exercise it for a long time at a steady state, and you don't require fuel during that exercise. So personally, I don't necessarily feel that's particularly useful for the pointy end of athletes who are trying to get a gold medal, because the competition is not who can exercise for the longest without eating, it's who can get across the finish line the fastest.
For most races that way.
So ultra endurance is where there's a lot of potential there for that. But if you look at the Olympics, so a marathon, those guys are not low carb, high fat. They are burning through truckloads of carbohydrates because they're a fast, efficient way of getting fuel to the muscles, or the muscles, getting ATP, essentially getting the ability to move. And so my approach is more specific than that. It's trying to it's been described in science as personalized carbohydrate, where basically you target carbohydrates to the type of session that you're doing. So if you want to do a really high quality training session where you're exercising really hard and you are going at a good pace, then you want to fuel that session with carbohydrates. If, however, you're doing a longer, slower, less intense, you're turning the legs over, it might be for a long period of time, you might turn the legs over for a few hours, but if you're doing that, you don't need those carbohydrates to fuel that session optimally, and it's a really good opportunity to use fat as a fuel. And so some of the specific strategies that you've talked about and that I got you to do was you can just withhold carbohydrate for 12 hours prior to that session, and you'll be in a low carbohydrate state, and you'll be forced into metabolizing fat. And if you do that over a few weeks and a few months, you'll get the same benefits as somebody who's doing a chronic or a long-term low carbohydrate diet, but you won't have the disadvantages of that. So the sessions that you do want to fuel well, you will be able to fuel well, and you'll be able to power
so
on
that's
carbohydrates.
Intervals and
so your interval
fast
sessions.
stuff alike.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And what about gym stuff? Do people, because that's applying a high force as a different energy system again, but people who are on a very low carbohydrate diet still can provide adequate strength?
I think again at the pointy end where you're talking about elite performance, maybe not.
Okay.
Although I think the jury's still out. I think all the potential for that low carb style of eating is seen in endurance sports. So the science hasn't really been done so much in those strength-based things. Physiologically, you would suspect that they're a little bit limited, but I don't think
because it's so anaerobic that you often put it on the same continuum, but it could be on a different continuum if you think about the phosphocreatine.
They're different fuels, I guess.
But for definitely anything that requires working really hard from 30 seconds up to even really hard for 1 hour, I think that would be the zone. You might agree that you would notice a reduction in pace if you're reliant on fat and those kind of intensities. That's the science. That's what the science is indicating. That those are very much you want to be burning carbohydrates during those sessions, and so you're right. So you really hammer it out in those ones. Cool. So how else do you recommend kind of influencing those systems? You mentioned changing diet. Are there other ways that you've used?
So you can change your diet long term. You can eat very low carbohydrate for the rest of your life, and you'll get there. Or you can do it more specifically. So it depends on what time you're going to train. So if you're training in the morning, then you may not eat carbohydrates in the meal previous evening, and you train before breakfast. So you've had that 12-hour fast overnight, or approximately 12 hours, plus whenever you had maybe your lunch. So it might be 18 hours of no carbohydrate, and that's going to deplete your carbohydrate stores, and you go training in the morning, and you're going to be forced pretty quickly into that fat burning mode. What you mentioned is you can also deplete your carbohydrate stores through some exercise the night before training in the morning, and then those same principles apply depending on what time of the day you're training. So if you're training in the evening, you might need to withhold your carbs from breakfast and lunch, and then go out before dinner time without having had any carbs that day. When you go longer, if you're doing a long run or cycle, 3 hours or more, you're going to deplete your carbs within the first hour or two of that exercise. So you don't even need to withhold carbs. Say you trained in the afternoon before dinner, you could have carbs at lunchtime, but within an hour or two of that training session, you've got no carbs anyway. So you're going to be at that point. The decision there is whether or not you have the gels and the bananas or whatever you want to have, and whether or not you have them is going to affect whether you're carb burning or fat burning throughout that session.
Cool. And going on to racing, how do you then combine a race day strategy with a training strategy? I know there's the concept of train low, race high. Is that something that you think has significant merit, or should we be training exactly how we race?
Well, both probably. You shouldn't be racing doing something that you haven't done during training. So whatever you do on race day, you must have practiced it during training. So
it's not just like pulling back the big slingshot and then
going for it. That's the most important thing, because nutrition is a skill in itself. Like if you're a cyclist and you're trying to eat a gel in a bunch and you haven't practiced that before, then that you might run into some fairly serious problems. And even if you're a runner, just the process of getting it out of your pack and consuming that gel in a way which doesn't interfere with your rhythm and your pace and all that type of thing is really important. So you want to know what types of flavors you like, what types of packets you like it to be delivered in, all those sorts of things. And even standing on the start line, having that confidence that you actually know what you're going to be doing and you know that it's worked before in training is really important. So that's kind of the strategy or psychological side of it. But physiologically, the evidence, and this is kind of more anecdotal, from what I know, the real strong advocates of the low carbohydrate, high fat world do still advocate for carbohydrates during exercise. For those who want to achieve really high performance gains, if you're just happy getting around the course and enjoying it and sticking with your chosen way of eating, then maybe you don't want to consume those really sugary foods. But if you're looking for performance, then there's no doubt that sugar is the fuel. There's nothing legal that's better. I was going to say there's nothing better, but there is. But in terms of ergogenic aids or performance enhancing aids which are legal, then sugar is the best thing that you can do.
I know some people have been, it's still pretty preliminary, but there are a few products with exogenous ketones that people say are they feel like gels, essentially. Right. But I guess that's kind of new, and there's so few people who have delved into it. I just don't think there's much knowledge out there. But there are a few people who are anecdotally advocating that they're using exogenous ketones.
I think
but they must be they're very well fat adapted. Just to churn those ketones through.
I don't know the science. I'm not sure how many randomized control trials have demonstrated that, but anecdotally for sure. And I don't think those are going to be particularly useful for those who haven't been doing that, been trying to build up to that point. But if you have, then I think trial and training, definitely. And let us know how it goes, because I think in the absence of those scientific trials, then anecdotal evidence is still really, really relevant.
Cool. And what else on race day do you think is useful? So we're trying not to do something completely different, but do you want to talk through the kind of race day nutrition philosophy that you would subscribe to? Yeah,
sure. So I think it starts with your and this is a bit of a disclaimer, is I think all this stuff's really interesting and it's what we've worked on together, but I think this is not where you'd start with your nutrition. If nutrition is something that you're trying to build into your program to improve your performance, you wouldn't go straight to this kind of fat adaptation thing. There's some foundations which you need to
let's go.
So the first thing is, I think we can there's a million and one people already talking about what a healthy diet is, so we won't go into that. But that is the foundation, because if you don't have a healthy diet, then especially combined with a heavy endurance program, you might get sick. And if you're not sick, you're not training. And if you're not training, you're not getting fitter. So making sure that you're following a healthy diet is the first building block. And then so that's kind of your day-to-day diet, and then there's your exercise-specific diet, and I break that into your pre-exercise nutrition, your during-exercise nutrition, and your recovery, your post-exercise nutrition. So if we relate that to race day, your pre-exercise meal, generally 1 to 4 hours, 2 to 4 hours, depending on what works for you prior to exercise. And this is why it's super important to trial this in training first. If you're a bacon and eggs kind of guy, then don't get all motivated and have Weet-Bix the morning of your marathon. Probably stick to bacon and eggs. Even though it wouldn't fit with the guidelines, you've got to go with what you've done during training. So I do recommend, the guidelines are to have a carbohydrate-rich meal, which is generally lower in protein and lower in carbohydrates, because that's generally easier on the gastro system to digest and going to make you feel good and things like that. But I think I've moved away from those concrete guidelines to saying to people, you've got to have what makes you feel good. And if you feel good with bacon and eggs, then that's probably better for you. I would say though that if you feel good with bacon and eggs now, and your race is in 6 months' time, then perhaps over this next 6 months we can work towards a more ideal pre-training meal, and that would involve some carbohydrates to top up those glycogen stores. And that's why having this time during training is really important, because you can have those meals which have carbohydrates in them, but then you can have those meals without those carbohydrates and get those other benefits that we've talked about. So excuse me, the carbohydrate-rich meal is recommended prior to endurance exercise, and then being well hydrated at the start line. So sipping on water, and that right from when you get up to when you're at the start line. You don't need to stress about electrolytes and things like that, I believe, but making sure that you've got a water bottle handy and that you drink from it. Cup of coffee, caffeine is a pretty good drug. I'd recommend that, but that's that's a bit more kind of the pointy end of the pyramid in terms of performance. But
again, some people just don't do well with caffeine, especially in the morning. Some people find they get quite wired and it's too much, but other people, don't do well without it.
Yeah, exactly.
Testing,
But I always say about caffeine, it was banned. It was a banned drug for a reason. It still works, so get involved. But the other pre-training thing for endurance athletes would be your nitrates or your beetroot juice. So again, we're getting to the pointy end, your supplements, which is not where you'd start your training program, but about an hour prior to your run would be when you would have them, if you're going to have them. And they're awesome. Like, they've got some really good results, and so it would be worth looking into for those who are interested. They enhance oxygen delivery to the muscles, and there are some bit of evidence coming out about other types of just general health benefits of those high nitrate foods as well.
So what else does that include?
Well, beetroot's the best.
And that's the one that the product was made.
Yeah, so there's like Beat It and there's a couple of companies in New Zealand. I can't remember their names. R-Line and I think Pure Sports Nutrition do a beetroot product, although I can't remember their specific names. But I did a run a couple of weeks ago, which I hadn't trained for, so I was on the beetroot juice all week prior, because I was trying to make up for a lack of training, but it didn't really work.
So what else is in that category? Do you know of anything else, or is it just a beetroot thing? Does it spread to other?
Oh, so dark green leafy vegetables is where you find those nitrates, but it's difficult to eat it. It's much easier to supplement it. Otherwise, you'd be having to eat it with a lot of spinach, and kale and things, and it's not really realistic. But anyway, we kind of digress. It is interesting, though.
Yeah.
So then you're standing on the start line. You're well hydrated. You've topped up your glycogen stores through your pre-exercise nutrition. You may have decided to carbohydrate load, but that's actually it's easier to carbohydrate load than a lot of people think. I think it's really beneficial. There is science which shows that it's good. Although if you've been really paying attention to your nutrition over a period of time, and then you do your race day taper, and you include carbohydrates in each meal of the day in those last few days, you're likely to be doing some form of carbohydrate loading anyway. Like your glycogen stores, your muscle are going to build up.
Would you say that there's a pretty solid ceiling on that storage determined by the training that you've done? And you can't just keep shoveling more in.
No, that's not going to help. You'll feel sick. Again, it's all to do with that whole concept of trialing and training before. And if you haven't been eating well during training, and then come race day you pile in the carbs 3 days before because you're carbohydrate loading, you're going to be worse off on race day, I believe. It's kind of an extension of your training program. Like, leading into your long runs during training, you should be having carbohydrate-rich meals for those events that you want to be, have carbohydrate for. You should be doing that, the day before anyway. And for a lot of people, it's just the difference between maybe they replace a few glasses of water with a few glasses of juice, and the extra sugars that they're getting from that is enough to form their carb load.
But you can't just get a second bowl of rice and shovel that in, and then get a second bowl of oats in the morning. If you've been eating properly, you just max out. It just gets converted to fat, I guess, because there's nowhere else in the muscles and the liver to
exactly. There is, there's certainly there's very good evidence that you do get bigger stores for a period of time, but it's not something that I'd focus on if you haven't been doing a good job in training of it anyway. But it's good technique if you've been eating well. So then you get the starting gun goes off and you're running. Now this is where this whole low carb, high fat versus a traditional high carbohydrate training diet really the balance comes in, because there's the incredibly strong undisputed evidence that carbohydrate is a very powerful performance enhancing product, and it has a dose response. So what that means is the more you can have, the better. So if one version of myself was racing another version of myself, we had done exactly the same training in the lead up, and version 1 had 30 grams of carbs an hour, and version 2 had 80 grams of carbohydrates an hour. All the science indicates that 80 grams an hour is going to perform much better than 30 grams per hour, who's going to perform much better than 10 grams per hour. So there's this dose response. So it comes back to this whole, you don't do on race day what you haven't done in training. So if you've been doing a low carbohydrate approach throughout your long runs, and you haven't developed that ability to metabolize, to digest and absorb and feel comfortable consuming those carbohydrates, then you're going to be at a disadvantage compared to the version of yourself who did a lot of those training sessions consuming carbohydrates. And it's actually a very interesting physiological adaptation, really, because if you consume carbohydrates during exercise, then enzymes involved in the digestion and absorption of carbohydrates get upregulated, and so you have more enzymes on your side to digest and absorb those carbohydrates on race day if you've been doing it during training. But if you don't do it during training, then they're not there on race day. And that's when people run into the gastric troubles. It's because they've gone all through training having little to no carbohydrates during exercise, and then they pick up their race day pack and it's got 6 gels in it, and they decide that they're going to have these gels on race day, but they don't have the capability to absorb that during that race.
So it just builds up backlogs,
yeah.
whatever's going on in there.
It might come out real quick, or it might get stuck. It depends on the person, but it depends how lucky you are. But so when I'm doing a big race, and when my clients are doing a big race, then I want them to have experienced and practiced consuming as much carbohydrates as possible during some of their training sessions, so that on race day they know what they can tolerate, and hopefully the amount that they can tolerate is higher. Science has studied up to 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Wow. So that's 4 gels an hour, and that's if you don't drink a carbohydrate-containing sports drink.
Yeah.
And those people perform better than people doing 50 grams an hour. So that's elite kind of athletes. If you're a fairly competent person who's trying to be their best on race day, then 75, 80 grams an hour is something to aim for. It's a lot. People
I did a podcast with Sam Clark, and I think in the kayak he's going hard in the kayak going coast to coast, and he was getting close to 90, I think. Yeah. Very impressive. That's a lot to chug down, but running, I think he can do 50 to 60.
Okay.
So difference between sports there, even for the top guys.
Emily Miasga, of M's Power Cookie fame, the Coast to Coast legend, she put her success down to the fact that she ate her heart out on the kayak as well. Yep. So that final cycle, she was starting
from top to up.
Yeah, exactly. So she was using that super efficient carbohydrate as her fuel, and she reckons she used to mow down all the men because she'd just eaten so much on the kayak, and it felt so good for that last cycle. So
So just to clarify, if people are getting 90 to 100, as they're getting closer to that limit, is the kind of amount of fiber and protein and stuff going down as well to get it in? Is it like you're just going gels and fluids to get there, or are people actually tolerating whole foods to get up to 90?
Generally, they're doing the gels and the sugars, and I think it's very much a personal thing. But I think to achieve those very high numbers, you've got to go there.
Yeah.
So you can look at it too, and it depends on you as a person. If you don't want to have all that sugar, then yeah, whole foods might be better. Bananas, you might make some rice cakes and flapjacks and things like that. But gels, at the end of the day, I think a really good way of describing gels is they have everything you need and nothing you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So your intestines and stomach aren't busy dealing with stuff that you don't need, that aren't going to aid performance. You've just been fed this very finely balanced ratio of sugars, and that's all basically, and a bit of fluid to wash it down with.
Yeah.
And it's very easy for your intestines to absorb. But oh man, that's kind of gross as well. So you don't want to be doing that the whole time. And if you're not trying to win, you've got to think about what those benefits are and whether you might be better off having healthier foods.
Yeah, and some people do start finding them unpalatable halfway around. They're just 3 hours of gels and their body's rejecting them.
Yeah, so different flavours and different tastes and textures and things like that.
Totally, I've got some brands that I can get down, and other brands they're coming back up after 20 minutes. Yeah. So there's
and in your Tarawera, they've got amazing aid stations, don't they? So they've got a whole range of different foods available there, so you can kind of take your pick on what you feel like. And coast to coast is a good one. In those last transitions, I would encourage people to have a few different options in bags. So they might have their gel bag, and they might have their whole food bag, like bananas and rice cakes, or they might have chip sandwiches, or they might have soup or something like that. Because they come out of that kayak, and you could feel 10 different ways. You could feel it could be a hot day and you feel great. It could be a cold day and you're miserable because you fell out a couple of times. And if you have those different options available, then you can just choose whatever one that you feel like. Because at the end of the day, after 10 hours of pushing yourself, you can feel. You don't know how you're going to feel, do you? So you can't predict what food that you're going to feel like either.
No, I think it's quite good advice to build that contingency in. It's really hard to know. So what else we were talking about pre, during, and then post? Or while we're sort of lingering on the during, do you see any benefits in racing or training to consuming a small amount of protein or fat?
Well, the ketones thing that you mentioned, I guess you'd put that in that fat category. There's also the medium chain triglycerides, which some people consume as well. And again, I don't know much about it. I think if I was trying to win the Olympic gold medal for the marathon, I don't know that I'd have them. Mm-hmm. But if I was a recreational runner who was trying to run fast, then maybe there's a benefit for them because they're maxing out your fat things.
Are there other benefits with the protein apart from fueling? So not talking about fueling, but just maintaining other processes that are really important to continue exercise.
I think over ultra events, then yes, because you're going. I mean, think about if you went to work for the day and you had your sandwiches and with your meat in there, and you had your milk and your breakfast, and you got protein just for your day-to-day work, versus the day when you go out and do an Ironman or a coast to coast, you're away for the same period of time, but so you do have those protein requirements, but it's about finding how much without getting in the way of your carbohydrate intake. Yeah. And I think that's personal, but there's not a huge amount of like randomized control trials which point strongly in one direction, but it appears as though a little bit of protein and fat in ultra races is comfortable and those adventure races and makes you feel good because you're getting different tastes and things like that. Mm-hmm. But say you're doing a marathon or something like that, then there's not so much evidence, apart from during training, it may aid recovery. Having that protein already on board, your recovery might be a little bit more complete. But that's also controversial because there's a lot of other studies which would indicate that you can easily make up for that protein intake just by having it later on in the day. Yeah. But
big dinner.
Yeah, but then tournaments are different again. Like if you're in a sevens rugby tournament, or if you're going off to a hockey tournament, which is over a few days, then and your recovery time is limited. If you're playing an evening game and you've got one the next morning, then some protein before and during the exercise may not interfere with performance, but it might aid recovery. So
and then by the time day 3 comes around, you're in a better place than you otherwise would be. Oh, that sounds good. So on to post. What are people?
So if we're talking endurance exercise.
Yeah, let's talk about endurance, trail.
Yeah, and to be honest, it actually doesn't change a lot. Carbohydrates are still the traditionally. You're basically replenishing your glycogen stores. You're topping them up so that to ensure that when you go to do your next training session, it's optimal. You're able to train as hard as you can. And of course, if we dart back to what we talked about at the start, maybe you don't want that to be the case, and then you may withhold carbohydrates.
Yeah, right.
I guess your recovery meals, we're talking about muscles as well. So protein, certainly, but you don't need a lot of protein in each meal. You just need to have it consistently over the day. I encourage people to include protein in every meal, and snacks as well. And the body cannot really absorb more than 25-ish grams of protein. So that's about
one go, you mean?
Yeah, so that's about 100 to 150 grams of meat or something. Might be about
course of a day.
No, in a meal.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah,
150 grams of meat would give you maybe 25, 30, 35 grams of protein. Your body's not going to absorb a hell of a lot more than that anyway. Well, the typical sized person, bigger, stronger people may.
We'll leave aside people who are focusing highly on bodybuilding or powerlifting and stuff there.
So it's pretty easy to meet your protein requirements, and so protein is so strongly associated with recovery through marketing. People forget the carbohydrates, so I tend to focus more on the carbs because they're very important, and people tend to take care of the protein themselves. So consuming carbohydrates as soon as possible after exercise, and then again 2 or 3 hours after. I say to people, it depends when their training is, but if they're training before a meal, then eat the meal afterwards, and then ensure that they have a good quality protein and carbohydrate containing snack 2 or 3 hours later.
Okay.
So
that was either do the snack and then the meal.
Yeah.
That was the first example.
Yeah, do the snack and then the meal, or the meal and then the snack, as long as you've got one combination of the two there. And that's a practicality thing. It doesn't matter, in my opinion, what you do. It more depends on when you train and what you feel like after training and things like that.
Yeah.
And the important thing to remember about recovery is that the whole window of opportunity in terms of recovery is becoming less important the more we know about it.
Yeah, okay.
Recovery is a 24-hour process,
right,
and there's only so much that you can do immediately. You can really hammer that 1 or 2 hours after it, but you're only focusing on 1 or 2 hours of the 24-hour window, really. So if you put all your time and attention into that 1 or 2 hours, then you're missing out on all the benefits. Well, you're not necessarily, but you're potentially missing out on the benefits that you're getting over that whole 24 hours of recovery. So
okay, that's interesting. Is that on a similar line to that half an hour window for getting carbohydrates back in? There used to be something we were told.
Yeah, it is. It's similar. I still think that you should make the most of, because what that window is a window where your body's very efficient at absorbing nutrients, and so to me it makes sense, especially if you've got a large training body and you do have high caloric needs anyway. If you're not eating 1 or 2 hours after training, when are you eating, and are you able to eat enough? And so you should make the most of that time, but by describing it as this window of opportunity, it almost means that there's no opportunity otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's true. It takes home that it's either like all or nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's not. It's not that. There is certainly opportunity to recover well outside of that 1 or 2 hours, but you may as well make the most of it. So eat then and eat later.
Yeah. Oh, that's quite good. So extending that 24-hour after training window, is there any other advice you'd have?
Well, you're going to be asleep for part of that 24 hours, so don't take it too literally. There's no science to indicate that you should be waking up in the middle. Even bodybuilders have set alarms and eaten in the middle of their sleep and things like that. It doesn't seem to have benefited them. So certainly not for endurance runners. It's not going to make it. Well, you shouldn't do it because sleep is
so
we're
important.
learning more about how important sleep is. So don't interfere with that. But carbohydrate. Oh no, I was going to say all the micronutrients. So thinking about those other sides of things. So if carbs are your petrol, and sometimes I describe fat as your diesel, and protein being like the bodywork to your car, then the micronutrients are the oil. So making sure that you're eating those iron and calcium and all the vegetables and things like that.
Yeah.
Don't forget about them, because they may not get you from A to B, but you might not get off the start line because you're sick or something like that. So. So
it's just all these cellular efficiencies are dependent on all
exactly.
these little things.
And your immunity. I mean, with a large training program, and you have low energy availability because you're using so much energy for exercise that there's less available, potentially, if you're not eating well, less available to keep yourself healthy. So your immune response is compromised and things like that. So it's all very important to consume that range.
Cool. Well, I think that's a really nice little summary. I hope some people get some value from something so concise, and it'd be interesting to see how much value people get, and it'll be good to get into the weeds more with you in the future maybe, and talk about some very specific manipulations that I know people are experimenting with, and they'll be interested to hear your take on them.
Cool.
So,
Oh, thanks,
a lot,
Tom.
Tom.
I think we could go on forever, couldn't we? But
Yeah. Sweet. Thank you.
Cheers, mate.
If you're enjoying the Perfect Flow podcast and want more value from it in the future, there are some ways you can support it. The first is to rate or leave a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or other platforms where it's available. The second is to share this podcast or specific episodes on social media or with friends. The third is to get involved more directly through the Perfect Flow page on Facebook, where I'm trying to construct a more interactive community. I want Perfect Flow to belong to the listeners, and if you tell me what topics you're most interested in, or even suggest specific guests, I'll do my best to make it happen. This is your opportunity to be part of something that answers your questions and adds value to your life. Another good reason to follow Perfect Flow on Facebook is that I post links to episodes, blog posts, and anything I find useful to this page. It's a great way to follow my training, racing, and learning. Another great way to stay engaged is to subscribe to beveridge.nz. This way you will get podcasts and blogs emailed to you, avoiding the clutter of Facebook. I don't know where this project will take us, but the reception so far has been positive. Who knows where we might be in a few years.